Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today's video is probably my most requested video ever. So I thought I'd better fulfill people's requests. So today's video is going to be a consensus list of the top 10 fragrances for life, but from male content creators' perspectives on YouTube. So to do that, I've gone away and I've watched every single top 10 fragrances for life video from male creators over the past year. So if you're interested to see the consensus overall top 10 brands and top 10 fragrances for life, then please keep on watching. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I'm a scientist in real life, so I think I look at things in a slightly different way to some people here on YouTube. And I like to do these kinds of analytical videos. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing and also like this video if you do end up enjoying this content. So to create this list, I've watched 22 fragrance videos from 22 content creators. And I have to say, when I searched YouTube for top 10 fragrances for life, there were some creators who were making these videos every 6 months like clockwork. So I only took their latest list, their most recent list, to include in this list because I didn't want their extra choices to really skew the data here. Also, there were some content creators who literally used the title top 10 fragrances for life for pretty much every video they did. So I really only took the videos that were actually their top 10 fragrances for life, not their top 10 summer fragrances for life or their top 10 Middle Eastern fragrances for life. So yeah, their general top 10 lists were used. Also, clearly, some people use different terms for fragrance. I won't have picked up, for example, people who have their top 10 colognes for life, or their top 10 scents for life, or their top 10 perfumes for life. So really, we're hoping that most male content creators have used the term top 10 fragrances for life. And I've also specifically included lists that were created by male content creators only. So those 22 content creators actually included 224 fragrances in their overall lists. So clearly they were including a few more in some places, or perhaps they just can't count to 10, I'm not quite sure. Geographically, 17 of these 22 channels were based within the US, so this isn't a good representation of the world. 3 of the content creators were based in the UK, and then the remaining channels were from Portugal and also from India. So really, it's a very US biased kind of opinion on the top 10 fragrances for life that we're seeing here. I also looked at the number of subscribers that these channels had, and those ranged from 1,180 subscribers for the smallest channel to 3.54 million subscribers for the largest channel, which is more of a general channel. So really it's interesting to look at the number of subscribers that a channel has, because ultimately if a channel has more subscribers, they're more likely to be getting more PR. And actually 12 of the channels out of the 22 had subscriber levels over 20,000. So next, let's look at the top 10 brands in these lists, and in 10th spot was Nishane with 6 mentions in total. And Nishane are a Turkish brand and they just seem generally quite popular. They've had a few hits, but there was one particular YouTuber who mentioned 3 separate Nishane fragrances in his top 10. So I think that really did skew the list a little bit towards them being included in the top 10. Actually, they beat out Initio, who had 5 mentions and were in 11 spots. That's interesting. In 9th spot were Creed with 7 mentions, and that really contrasts with the female creators list. Female creators mentioned them in their list, but they didn't even chart in the top 15. So clearly Creed are much more popular with male creators here on YouTube. So in 6th equal position were Xerjoff, Dior and Mancera. So Xerjoff and Dior didn't really surprise me, but Mancera I was quite surprised to see. In 5th spot with 9 mentions were Chanel, and I'm not surprised to see those in the top 10, but I am surprised that they are a little bit higher than Dior. I really thought that Dior might outstrip Chanel in this list. In 3rd equal spot were Tom Ford and Roja, and they both had 10 mentions each in these top 10 for life lists. Actually, Tom Ford are quite a popular brand, I think, and they came up in the women's list, but actually Roja were just not there at all. And this is a massive difference between male content creators and female content creators. So the 2nd place brand was actually Amouage, and they had 11 mentions in these lists. And Amouage, I think, has really come up from not nowhere, but they've been sort of a brand that not many people talked about in the last sort of 5-10 years, to becoming really quite mainstream and quite popular now, even though they are at quite a high price point. I think Amouage are just a brand that have released a few really popular collections recently. They've perhaps been giving a little bit more PR as well, which has got them a little bit more exposure. So I'm not really surprised that they are charting at number 2 in this list. So finally, in first position of the most mentioned brand was Perfumes de Marly, and they actually had 12 separate mentions of 9 different fragrances in these top 10 lists, which really shows quite a diverse love for the brand. And that really surprises me given that Initio did not even make the top 10. They're sister brands. You would expect Initio to be a similar footing to Perfumes de Marly, really, or I would. But yeah, I guess Perfumes de Marly just have a lot of very big hits, and that's probably enabled them to make the number 1 on this list. So in comparison to the female content creators list, the thing that strikes me about the male content creators list here is that most of the brands are not part of larger perfume conglomerate brands. So okay, there's LVMH, there's Estee Lauder, there's Advent, but really most of those top 10 brands are independents. So next, let's look at the top 10 fragrances for life overall in these lists. So actually the cutoff is pretty low for being in the top 10. Anything that had 3 or more mentions were in the top 10 fragrances here. And actually a lot of fragrances were tying for certain positions. So we're going to go straight in at third equal position, and those fragrances all had 3 mentions each. And there were 8 different fragrances that charted at third equal. So those fragrances included Amouage's Interlude Black Iris, Parfums de Marly's Carlisle, Initio's Side Effect, Argos's The Triumph of Bacchus, Mancera's Cedra Boise, Nichané's Hasabat, Roja's Oceana and Roja's Elysium. So what I notice about all of those fragrances is really that they're all quite old. They're all over 4 years old. And actually Cedra Boise from Mancera is 13 years old. So these are all very established fragrances on the market. They've had time to gain in popularity and to get into those top 10 lists. Also, these fragrances are all niche fragrances. They're all kind of mass market niche fragrances. There aren't any designer choices here. There's also quite a good note profile mix. So there are the sweeter vanillic ones, the ones with rum, the ones with tobacco, but then there are also the fresher ones, the more aromatic ones as well. I think it's also important to note here that Mancera's Cedra Boise Intense was the second most mentioned Mancera fragrance in the list, with 2 mentions. So actually if Mancera hadn't made that flanker fragrance, perhaps Cedra Boise would be charting much higher than it is. So finally, the top 2 fragrances are actually in first place, but equal first place, because they both have 4 mentions each. And I think most people will be able to guess which fragrances these might be actually. They've been around a while and they are from quite famous lines. So the 2 fragrances are Creed Adventus and also Dior Homme Intense. So the interesting thing here is that Dior Homme Parfum also had 2 mentions. So actually that line is probably overall the most loved here. But Creed Adventus, you know, it's an old fragrance. It's got loads of dupes. People are always talking about the clone fragrances, aren't they? They're always saying how they last longer, how they're actually more consistent in their formulations, how, you know, Creed can be sometimes disappointing with its variation in how it smells. So I'm really surprised that Creed Adventus is still at the number 1 spot. It's still being mentioned that much. With the Dior Homme line, I have to say that I absolutely love the first iteration of Dior Homme, and I think that it's just such a beautiful fragrance, and it's something that I can really see why there's so much love for that fragrance line. So I also looked to see if there was one particular perfumer that was really standing head and shoulders above the rest, and really in these lists, the 2 perfumers that stood out were Roja Dove and also François Demochy. So François Demochy has had this huge success with his Dior Homme line, and that's probably why he's quite so popular in this list. But also Roja Dove, you know, 2 mentions of 2 fragrances in the top 10. He's doing pretty well. And finally, I tried to compare the male creators list with the female creators list and see whether there were any fragrances that are sort of bang in the middle, whether people consider certain fragrances to be both great fragrances for men and also great fragrances for women. So I tried to look at which fragrances were really heavily overlapping in these lists, and really there was one fragrance that stood out above the others, and that was Parfums de Marly's Herod. I guess that fragrance is just a very friendly vanillic DNA that is appealing to quite a lot of people. To a lesser extent, there was also overlap with some Xerjoff fragrances, so Naxos, also La Capitale, and also Herba Pura were mentioned in both the male and female creators lists, as well as Baccarat Rouge 540, Tom Ford's Black Orchid, Nefs from Nichané, and also Kilian's Angel Share. So if you made it this far, then please do consider subscribing, and also please like this content if you have enjoyed this video. So please let me know also what you think of these top 10 lists. Are you surprised by what's made it to number 1? Are you surprised that there are no newer fragrances coming up in that top 10? And what do you think this says about the state of modern perfumery? I'd love to know your opinions. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.